Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, April 9th, 1994, the Florida Senate votes to grant, quote, equity, justice, fairness, and healing to survivors of the 1923 Rosewood Massacre. This was a moment in which the state of Florida started to reckon with the devastation that had taken place in Rosewood, racial violence that destroyed Black lives and a Black community. The story of what happened in Rosewood is really worth telling, as is the story of Rosewood, right? Because it took some 50 years for people to really come to understand what had happened in Rosewood. It was forgotten to time. And then there was more attention. And then this moment in 1994 of reckoning and some form of reparation. Of course, we sit here now in 1923, the 100th anniversary of the Rosewood Massacres. That was back in January. But this is a story we've wanted to get to for a long time. So let's do that right now with, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So where do you want to start? 1994, this moment of reparations, or back in 1923 in the moment of the Rosewood Massacre? I guess we haven't really done an episode on that. So this is a chance to tell that story too.
Well, first I should say that and we've talked about many massacres on this show before, but from the end of Reconstruction, pretty much all the way up through the 1920s, you had Black towns, all Black towns that were being destroyed, burned down to the ground, massive mob attacks, massive race riots that were taking place in big cities like Chicago or Washington, D.C., and then in smaller cities in places like Rosewood or Tulsa or Colfax. And so this is one of these incidences in which there are a lot of different reasons as to why these massacres start. Oftentimes it's a rumor or some sort of fear that a white woman was sexually assaulted, and then that rumor or story takes hold and it fuels violence and then mobs that just spread into massacres. And in this instance, that the same story happened. There was a white woman who accused a Black man of sexually assaulting her, and the Black town Rosewood was destroyed. Black people were killed. They were pretty much exiled, ran off their property and told never to come back. And it was a lot of damage that could have been prevented and was not. I think that's also important to say as well.
And listeners might notice that a lot of the massacres that we've talked about have taken place in the late 19-teens or the 1920s, because this really was a period of intensifying anti-Black violence. We've talked about Tulsa, which happens in 1921. This is a period when the Klan is resurging, when Confederate monuments are going up all over the country. And so this is of a piece with that moment of both violence and sort of rewriting history in a way that is happening in the 1920s. And Rosewood is part of that story too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Rosewood is a fairly rural town. And so, most of the businesses are burned down. The church, I believe, is burned down, and people flee, and they flee kind of into the wilderness and the swampland around it. There's actually a story to be told about how, a lot of them end up in Gainesville, and Gainesville sort of Black community has a lot of its roots in sort of aftermath of Rosewood as well. It's funny, Kellie, you were saying these incidents start for so many reasons. I'll just say from my perspective, so often the story is an accusation of sexual violence from a white woman against a Black man. And then, it's the spark. It's often not true. And then it's the spark, and that spark can light, a fire that sort of takes on a bunch of different forms. Yeah. But gosh, over and over, that feels like it's at the heart of a lot of these incidents.
It's usually either that, or in places like Louisiana or Arkansas, it's about Black workers that are advocating for themselves, trying to create a union, trying to get better wages or better conditions, and that starts a riot. But it's whether it's based off of a lie or even real activism, the through line, I think, in all of these stories is that, one, there is no state policing to stop these massacres, to like stop them until they get started, that it is literally mob rule, and that oftentimes a lot of the Black people who are losing their homes, they own property, they own land, and so there's an economic incentive to take that land away, or to make sure that they don't return, so that their land will then be up for grabs and other white people can come in and confiscate that property.
And in some ways, that's what sets the stage for reparations.
Yeah.
I think it's typically not the case that you get reparations for the loss of life or murder, but the taking of property becomes kind of the legal basis for making a claim for reparations.
Yeah. And so, well, we should say, in the aftermath of Rosewood itself, there is, like, as is often the case, very, very perfunctory legal action. There's a grand jury. It returns no indictments. But basically, this incident gets memory hold. About 50 years later, historians start to recover this story, tell the story. There's a big 60 Minutes piece in the wake of that. It sort of comes back into the public imagination. And then, it's still another 20 years until there's this moment of reparations and a sort of initial reckoning. What is our sense then, if we cut to 1994 in this moment that we're marking here? What is our sense of why the Florida legislature even takes this up, and what is the kind of contours of how they start to think about reparations?
So in 1994, there is a task force that is put together to create a grant that is based on equity, justice, fairness, and healing for the survivors of the Rosewood Massacre. And it does a couple things. One, it investigates the Rosewood Massacre in and of itself. It tries to bring validity to the claims, because for a long time, people believed, oh, this is hearsay, oh, that's a rumor, or it wasn't that bad. And they had several professors, scholars, and journalists who said, no, we actually have proof. We know that this happened and that how bad this was. And then another part of this was to really bring attention to it and acknowledge that it happened. And then the final part is to reckon with it, is to create reparations so that people can be compensated, not just for the loss of lives, but the loss of property, the loss of opportunity. So it's not a lot of money, but it's actually one of the few instances in which you have people getting compensated.
It's just a little over $2 million in the end. Yeah.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
And this is a period when across the United States, there is a kind of look back happening. So remember, it's in 1988 that Reagan signs the bill for reparations to Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II. It's during Clinton's administration, so around this same time that he's apologizing to Hawaii for the U.S. coup there, like making some
and
apologies
the
for
Tuskegee
U.S.'s...
experiment.
And so there is this kind of idea of looking back in this period. And then here you have the Florida legislature engaging in some critical race theory, which interesting.
Well, yes. Well, I definitely want to talk about some of the language in here and some reference in here, particularly as coming from Florida. The bill itself, though, in 94, it awards $150,000 in payments to survivors who could prove that they owned property during the massacre, sets up a scholarship fund for their descendants who attended state colleges. I mean, we don't have a ton of reparations bills to compare this to, but Kellie, what is your sense of whether the practical things included in here are the right approach when it comes to reparations?
I mean, for me, it is worthy that it happened, but it's still too small scale. Like, there are some things of course, you'll never be able to compensate for, like the loss of lives. But when it comes to making people whole and establishing wealth for them that they could have generated over the course of 80 years, 100 years, $150,000 is nothing. And the fact that a lot of these survivors are near the end of their life, you know, they're using this money for healthcare, they're using this money for basic necessities. It's not money that's going to make them wealthy the rest of their lives. And it's money that will be spent fairly quickly. There are students who have benefited from these scholarships, and I'm sure there is definitely an impact in being able to attend a state school free of tuition, but it's never enough. And I think that's the problem with a lot of these reparation efforts, is that the scale is never large enough. And so it does some things, but again, a lot of people are still left without.
Right. Well, I think that's in part because no one ever wants to address what you just described as the lost, the opportunity cost as economics.
Yeah, the compounded loss.
Right, but yeah, and generation after generation. And so I feel like a big part of this story is both that, you know, okay, specific payments for loss of property, we can feel like we can put a number around that, and then, you know, scholarship fund. But there wasn't a sort of attempt to reckon with, well, what would have happened had this incident not happened, and how do you put a number to that? In part because that number is going to be much, much, much bigger, and that's where the real impact of all this. I do also wonder that I would imagine that a big part of this is also, just as we mentioned, like some of the people were still around and or even, you know, parents or grandparents or whatever, and just the further and further we get away from some of these things, the less there is that sort of salient thing where you can just point at someone and be like, that person right there, or my grandmother or whatever.
And the hardest thing is proof, because you had to prove that you were a descendant. And so if in the case of like a lot of these incidences, it's traumatic. So parents, grandparents, they don't talk about it. They don't, not many people are going to be like, here was the deed. Here was the, you know, the smoking gun kind of thing. People don't have that.
Well, that I also wonder is if, in this particular case, the fact that Rosewood was a small, rural, isolated town, you can just kind of literally draw lines and be like, this is what we're doing reparations for. Whereas if you talk about kind of like, you know, a city or a marginalized community in a larger place, like it just gets, you know, people have a much harder time putting their head around that.
Yeah. Which is why I think there's been reparations for Rosewood and not Tulsa, is because of the scale, is because of the amount of wealth that was lost. Very few people, even extremely left-leaning politicians, are going to be willing to commit that kind of money to survivors. And even then, there's a backlash, a political backlash about, you know, what they're doing with the money. You know, we sort of want to litigate how people should use their money as well. And while school seems honorable, I don't know, even if you want to take it to a casino, like, that's your right? So, like,
it's your money.
It's your money. It's your money.
I think I mentioned this in the Japanese American reparations episode, but Eric Foner, who both Kellie and I worked with at Columbia, when he taught about the reparations for Japanese internment, one of the points that he made was the U.S. did this because it was easy for the U.S. to do, right? It was a small amount of money. It was a kind of buying forgiveness on the cheap. And that the challenge of doing reparations for, say, Black Americans can't be done the same way. Yeah. And so when you start dealing with those larger scale numbers, finding the political support for it is really, really challenging.
Yeah.
We should say, you know, this story took a long time to come back into public imagination. Then there was this moment here where there were actual bill passed. A few years later is when that movie Rosewood comes out, and I have not seen.
I've seen it. No one saw it. You know why? Because it made no money at the box office. I mean, it had. I just looked this up. It had a budget of $17 million. It made $13 million at the box office. So they never recouped the money they put in. I saw it. My dad took me to see it, but you know, my parents are like hardcore. You know, you're gonna learn today, and they would like take me to see all Malcolm X and all these movies. But like, but I think part of it is that, and this is a issue that's ongoing, is that people don't want to watch that kind of trauma play out on the screen. That's hard to sit through. You don't leave feeling gratified. You don't leave feeling empowered. Even if you witness, people like Vin Rhames on a horse standing up against injustice, it's still traumatic. And movies like that don't tend to do very well.
Yeah. Although, I think that a big part of how the sort of Tulsa anniversary was riding a momentum from, I think, a pretty kind of brutal portrayal of trauma in Watchmen and Lovecraft Country. And so, you see the role that this storytelling tells. Rosewood is directed by John Singleton, I believe. I'm going to go back and watch it. I bet you it holds. I bet you it's good.
I remember it being good. I remember being tough to watch, for sure. It's violent. But it was definitely something that had an impact on me. I never forgot it.
Yeah. All right. We can't not sort of talk about the Florida-ness of this. So the governor who signs this bill is a Democrat, but, it's passed in a bipartisan manner by the House and Senate. But just even the language in here. I mean, the fact that, the Florida Senate let language go by that use the word equity, justice, fairness, healing. Just like, it's incredible how many steps backwards we've taken just in terms of the kind of language that people were willing to use. And I'm sure that I'm sure there were opponents to this act, but the fact that like just even using the word equity is this like incredibly divisive thing right now, especially in a state like Florida. It's just remarkable to know that, a generation ago, Florida, you were okay with equity.
Yeah.
It's actually not even clear that you could teach about this episode in Florida classrooms today.
I know. That's what's so wild about all of this. It's that, like, had they waited longer, this might have never come. So it's like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the story for sure as well. And it's part of the story we're seeing now. But it's like what history gets written is as much a reflection on what happened as it is about the moment. Is more than anything a reflection of the moment in which it gets written. And so this story tells us a lot about what happened in the 70s when it first got resurfaced, and then in the 90s when this bill got passed, and then today when I think you're right, like Florida wouldn't touch this in the legislature or even in a school. And it's kind of incredible. And I should say, I suppose, we were remarking about how the 100th anniversary, which was just in January, kind of passed, and at least and I didn't see a ton out there, and part of me is like, well, I don't think that the DeSantis administration was kind of going out of their way to mark the 100th anniversary.
There's absolutely not a climate or a conversation to be had.
Yeah.
Yes.
Totally. All right. Well, that will bring us to the end of the episode. Folks, if you want to go watch Rosewood and tell us what you think of that movie, I'll be watching the next couple of weeks. We'll have a little informal movie club here. But Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Mardovich, executive producer, Yuri Lasordo, director of operations. Thanks to all of you who support this show by being members of Radiotopia. Find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find us on social, suggest topics, all that and more at our website, thisdaypod.com. See you soon.
Radiotopia from PRX.